Good morning, everyone. So this is the Realisation Festival, right? So it begs the question of what, how, and why we have to realise, and also to some extent where and when that might happen. The feeling we had last night was, oh my God, we're having such a good time, such a great place to be. And in that context, our host Nick is kind of like the good cop who says, behold the beautiful scenery, behold the marvellous house, behold the delicious food. And I guess this morning I'm playing the role of the bad cop, the kind of, why are we here? You know, shouldn't we be a bit more uncomfortable? Shouldn't we, what was the purpose again? What are we actually trying to achieve with all this? And I want to do that with reference to the idea of realisation, just to speak directly to what realisation might mean and why we've called the festival that. And it's titled in the book, Tasting the Pickle. And just to say briefly, Tasting the Pickle is an essay that's in this book, which just came out with Perspectiva Press. And it's a long essay of about 20,000 words, and it sort of summarizes the Perspectiva, as I see it, kind of overview of the world's conundrums, what we have to sort of reckon with at scale. And there are distinctions in there between the emergency we face and the sort of, particularly the climate emergency, the crisis of governance that we face, then lots of crises inside the crises, the kind of emotional, psychological, spiritual, aesthetic, cultural, relational, meta crises, the crisis inside the crisis. But I'm not going to speak about that as such. I'm just going to let you know it's there. That's the other talk that I might have given on another day. I wanted to speak instead more directly to the idea of realisation. So, realisation means three things in the context of this festival. Okay? There's the straightforward sense that actually is quite deep. There is the sort of personal, aspirational sense that has a rich philosophical tradition. And then there's the sort of practical, hands-on, let's get it done sense. So starting with the one that we have to just become aware of. So if you realize something, I was going to go for a walk this morning, but then I realized it was raining. Simple meaning. I was going to read that book, but then I realized I didn't feel like it. So a very simple notion of realization as becoming aware of a feature of reality that you weren't previously in touch with. Reality disclosing itself to you in some way. Now, why does that matter at a deeper level? Well, what is it that we have to realize today? What is the nature of the world that we're asked to understand, something we have to become aware of? Well, we have to realize that despite the comfort, despite the apparent order, despite the sense that the world is functioning more or less as it is, or as it should be sometimes, it feels like things are unfolding as they should be, and as in a way that's not so bad. Nonetheless, we do have data, we do have images, we do have a way of sensing that all is not well. Now, all has never been well, right? This idea that everything's falling apart doesn't always ring true, because we live in a time where, yes, you can see multiple crises coming through on the news, but historically there have been more wars. Historically, people have died younger. Historically, people were poorer. Historically, people suffered. We're often in servitude. We're at a phase of time where things are really going rather well in lots of ways. It's not a crisis of despair as such. What we have to realize is something a bit deeper, is that inside the apparent prosperity and the apparent order, there is this very, very powerful process of decay and breakdown underway that's just barely perceptible. But it's fundamental and perhaps even inexorable. That's what we have to realize. Now, why do I say that? There are several reasons. The climate crisis, the language of climate change is not just some abstract environmental issue coming from left field in which we carry on living as we do, but we have to attend to this thing coming in. No, the climate crisis is an entire shift in our setting, our perception of who we are as a species writ large, a global human species of 7.8 billion and growing number of people. And it's a game changer, and it should be a perception changer, because once you notice that it's not just that the climate crisis is happening, it's not just that the planet is getting hotter, and with that we have images like the sea being on fire, as I mentioned the other night. We have places where people actually have what they now call wet bulb temperatures, a term that I'd never heard before last week, where basically it gets so hot that you can no longer cool yourself down. No number of wet flannels or air conditioning is going to help you. The wet bulb temperature will literally kill you from too much heat. This is already happening on planet Earth, and it's getting worse. Now, that happened in a part of Canada quite remote from here. But as I say, the language to think about is not that it's here and present, but that it's sort of baked in, that it's coming our way. So one thing we have to realize is that things have changed. So it's not so much in your immediate, salient, graspable experience, but waking up to it, the politics of waking up, is that this is now part of our world. Now, when I say that, I'm conscious that not everyone thinks this way. For some, these bigger than self problems, these kind of issues that are beyond their immediate perceptual experience, beyond our immediate personal responsibility, not everyone feels them. Not everyone feels they're part of their life. It's something quite particular to groups like this, and maybe not even everyone here feels this way. But those who orient their identity, orient their sense of purpose towards global issues, are not the majority of the world. The majority of the world are dealing with subsistence issues, trying to get through the day, attending to their more immediate responsibilities with family, trying to get their children educated, putting food on the table, and so forth. So when we speak of what we have to realize, we are speaking of quite a small group initially. Not everyone, but over time, this awareness has to rise across the populations, of the whole world. So as a relatively privileged group in an extraordinarily beautiful place, one of the things we have to realize is that something has changed. Some people call this the anthropocene. A more powerful term with a bit more of a political edge is the capitalocene. Anthropocene speaks to a shift in geological time. That's not a small thing. To change geological time is no minor issue. We have to realize that has happened. The human influence on the planet is deleterious, and unless we wake up in some way, reverse course, shift perception, shift mode of operation, we're facing a progressively worse civilization at scale. And it's worse than that in a way, because when you think of, well, why haven't we dealt with it? Think of what Bio said yesterday, we're stuck. So the other thing we have to realize is not just that there's a game-changing issue, but that we're profoundly stuck. We've known about this. The problem is not knowledge. The realization in that sense is limited. We have to realize not only that there is something to realize, but also that we're not realizing it as a collective. We're not realizing it at scale. Some individuals are, many thousands are mobilizing. There are government departments focused on these problems. But if you look at the data, the signal and not the noise, we're not coming even close to dealing with the underlying problem. And like I say, the problem is not like any other problem. This is the only habitat we have. It is John Ashworth said that the best way to understand climate change is that it's a multiplier in a nexus of systemic risk. In other words, food security, water security, viable habitats. The very basis of life itself is at stake. Now, we don't feel that yet with our delicious breakfast and our easy supermarket access. But it's coming, and the reason it matters that it's coming is, well, someone will deal with it. That's where we have to realize it's not the case. It's not being dealt with. It's actually a distinct and singular challenge that we don't seem to be able to learn, right? And that word learn is critical. So the next thing we have to realize is that there's a learning imperative baked in. We have to, the idea of Bildung that sort of seeded this festival, and actually there was an interesting moment of realizing in that sense, because Nick and I at some point realized that this Bildung was a pattern that connected the organization of Perspectiva and its founders, who'd both written about Bildung, and the history of St. Giles' House. And Bildung in the 21st century has to look like something pretty powerful. It has to look like a renaissance of global civil society at scale. If you really want people to wake up to the scale of the challenge, you're not talking about better light bulbs and electric cars, although that's part of the story. You are looking at a change in the underlying logic of society. What is it for? Is it indefinite economic growth? Is it private prosperity with some technical tweaks along the way? No, it will probably be a complete reorientation of what we're living for. And where will the resources for that idea come from? They'll come, broadly speaking, from education, like a sense of grappling with who we are as human beings, what we need to learn in order to deal with our historical moment. So the next thing we have to realize is that there's a learning imperative baked into the present moment. And it's a complex learning imperative. You don't get it in the classroom. Much of education now comes through the smartphone, which is an intensely addictive, hyper-stimulating device that most of the next generation, as I know from my own children, are going to live their lives through to some extent, unless some new patterns arise in which that addiction becomes less strong and the algorithms become less personally powerful. So the learning needs of the current civilization are deep and great and broad, and they're not the kind of needs you'll meet in a classroom. They will require a kind of waking up at scale of people who realize there is this collective action problem. How do we learn amongst ourselves? How do we teach each other, learn from each other, figure out what it is we need to know? And that knowledge will often be a kind of know-how. It will be a relational know-how. It will be an intrapersonal know-how. It will be about growing in the right way. It'll be about contextual sensitivity. It will not be the same for the whole planet. It will differ remarkably depending on your bioregion, depending on where you are geologically. There's a lot to learn and know. That's another thing we have to realize, right? So it's the first set of realization. That's only the first third. I'm going to do the second 2/3 quicker. The middle bit, the realization of the self that's in the idea of realization is a spiritual idea, really. It's about becoming who you're meant to be. And in that sense, to realize the self, to become a self-realized individual, is to find your unique contribution. One of the issues with climate change, and not just climate change, as I say in the essay on the Pickle, once you realize that climate change is not a discrete issue, but a kind of signal for the entire underlying fabric and logic of the whole world, once you sort of grasp that, and that's why we haven't dealt with it for decades despite knowing about it, you realize that you have to find a place in that. You have to contribute. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean retrofitting your home? Does it mean driving differently, flying less? Well, it might mean those things. Does it mean, petitioning your MP for some kind of legislation that might help at scale? It might mean that too. But really, if all you do is suggest to people the lowest hanging fruit, if all you suggest to people is do what everyone else has to do, deal with your plastic bags, deal with your daily behaviors, you won't get that far, right? Because those things don't make sufficient shifts at scale. What you really need to do is to find the place in the person's heart and mind that they are uniquely well placed to develop. So the changes you're looking for is something more like, not so much what can I do as one of 7.8 billion, but what can I do as this person with this background, with these desires, with these skills. If everyone can find that, then you have a much greater chance of each individual becoming somehow self-realized, finding their own unique contribution to the challenges of our time, but also multiplying those effects, because everyone ideally will be in their best positions, doing their best thing. Now, that's again a learning need. How do you find that? How does each individual find their own work in that way? It's a big challenge, but it's a collective challenge. And in the paper, I call it the challenge of collective individuation, that we each find our own individuated life and identity and personality through the collective challenges of this historical moment. That's one of the things we're aiming for. So that's the second kind of realization, the realization of the self in the historical context. The third kind is the most pragmatic and practical. How do you realize something? We've actually realized the Realisation Festival. Quick round of applause. Right. So it has happened. In other words, it went from an idea, a meeting, several meetings, a cancellation, an adjustment, to actually happening. That's a different kind of realization, to make something manifest in the world. Realization as manifestation. And that's really critical because, much as I love writing and talking, I do recognize that has to transmutate into something institutional, cultural, in a more enduring form. So the third kind of realization we need is, what does it mean institutionally? What are the new forms of institution we need? What are the new kinds of political party or platform that we need? What are the new forms of social media we need? Do we need a new currency? These are forms of realization making manifest the vision and idea of a different kind of society. So when we speak about reimagining the world, we're speaking in some ways about that kind of realization. The realization that's putting into practice different ways of living and working at scale. That might be a 4-day week. It might be a universal basic income. It might be some kind of global civil society, polycentric governance that we can't yet conceive, that's not about the nation state and not about the UN, but something entirely different that we haven't yet conceived of. And it might be that money is something entirely different in the future. And it might be that we actually realize we don't have to work so hard, that actually we're meant to enjoy life in some way, in some sense. But first, to get there, we have to really contend and reckon with where we are at this historical moment. Now, it's difficult because climate change as that signal issue, and as I say, I don't think the issue is climate change as such. I think there's a deeper set of meta-crises of which climate change is the most kind of recognizable. It's the issue that signals global, it signals collective, it signals time sensitive, it signals threat to habitat, it signals existential. But in amongst it, it's not a single issue by which you can hold everything else constant and treat that as the variable. It's endemic in everything. It's in that glass of water, it's in the lighting in this room, it's in our drive home and our train home, it's absolutely everywhere. And once you grasp that, it should shift your mind about how we recast society and our place in it. So those are three meanings of realization, just to recap. To realize something important about this moment, and I would say one is that we're in a new phase of geological time with a particular kind of imperative in it. Amongst that, there's a kind of distinct learning need for civilization as a whole. There was an underlying educational crisis amidst the ecological crisis. And then secondly, we have to find our own unique role in that challenge. The challenge of collective individuation, to find our place so we can uniquely contribute with these big historical challenges in mind. And then thirdly, to make manifest, to build the institutional and cultural code that and forms that we need to actually reimagine society at large. And that's the meaning of realization that underpins the Realisation Festival, that we very much hope is the beginning of a long tradition. This is a one-year event now, but this could last for 100 years, and maybe more. Knowing this house, it might well be more. So thank you very much.